There are people in your life who know you completely. Not who you present yourself to be, not who you are becoming, who you are. They are rare, and they do not stay. 3 days after the dissertation, Cicero took the first available flight to Nairobi. He had not called ahead. He never called ahead when it came to Osei. Some people you do not call ahead for. You simply arrive, because the alternative is that they tell you not to come, and you cannot afford to hear that. Dr. Hakeem Osei had been his professor once, then his mentor, then the closest thing to a father that Cicero, who had never known his own, had ever allowed himself to have. He was also, by the time of this story, a man that the academic world had done everything in its power to erase. 20 years earlier, Osei had published a paper on temporal loop energy, the relationship between closed time-like curves and quantum resonance fields. It was, in the simplest possible terms, 20 years ahead of its time. The academic community did not celebrate it. They did not even engage with it seriously enough to argue against it. They simply dismissed it. Reviews called it speculative to the point of fantasy. One reviewer, who later built his entire career on a theory adjacent to Osei's, described it as the work of a talented mind that has strayed beyond the boundaries of responsible science. Osei fought for 3 years to be heard. Then he stopped fighting. Not because he had decided he was wrong, because he had decided the world wasn't worth the argument. He opened the door before Cicero knocked. He had always done that. Some quality of attention that registered the sound of a specific person before they announced themselves. Cicero had asked him about it once, years ago. Osei had said, "When you have spent enough time listening to the world, you learn to distinguish the sounds that matter from the sounds that don't." He stood in the doorway of his small house, larger than he used to be through the shoulders, slower than he used to be through the eyes. His hair had gone entirely gray since Cicero had last seen him. He was holding a glass that was not empty. He looked at Cicero for a long moment. Then he said, and in his voice was everything, "You passed." Not a question. Osei never asked questions he already knew the answer to. Cicero said, 3-2. Osei stepped back from the door to let him in. He said, "Then we have something to discuss." The inside of Osei's house was the inside of a mind. Books everywhere, not displayed, lived in. Stacked on every surface, opened and left face down, annotated in margins, flagged with paper tabs. The kind of reading that was not a hobby, but a conversation with the dead, and the brilliant that had been happening for 40 years and showed no sign of concluding. On one wall, a single whiteboard. The equations on it were old. The ink faded from years of fluorescent light. Cicero recognized some of them. Some of them were from Osei's original paper. Some of them were something else entirely. He stared at the whiteboard for a long time. Osei, watching him from his armchair, said, "You see it?" Cicero said, "These aren't from the paper." Osei said, "No, they are not." "Sit down, Cicero. Show me what you brought." They worked for 3 days. Not the polite kind of working, the kind where two people sit at opposite ends of a table and occasionally compare notes. The real kind. The kind where you forget to eat, where you write on whatever surface is available, paper, the back of envelopes, once the steam on the bathroom mirror because neither of them wanted to stop long enough to find a fresh page. Saya called twice. Cicero answered both times, and both times said, "I'm fine," and both times hung up before she could ask any of the questions she was clearly holding. The first day, they worked through Cicero's dissertation, Osei reading every line with the patience of someone who has learned not to rush understanding. The second day, they combined it with what was on the whiteboard. The third day was different. On the third day, Osei went to the small, locked drawer beneath his desk. He took out a key from a chain around his neck, the kind of key you wear against your skin because you cannot afford to leave it somewhere you might forget. He unlocked the drawer. He took out a folder. It was thick, heavy, the kind of folder that has been added to over years and years. Its cover worn smooth at the edges, its spine reinforced with tape that had itself begun to peel. He held it for a moment. He looked at it the way you look at something you have been carrying for a long time, with that mixture of relief and grief that comes from finally being able to set something down. He set it on the table between them. He said, and his voice was different now, quieter and more careful, the voice of someone about to say something true that they have not said out loud before. I have been working on something for 11 years. I did not publish it. I did not show it to anyone. I was afraid. Cicero looked at him. He would think about this moment for the rest of his very long life. The only time he had ever heard Osei use that word about himself. He said, carefully, "Afraid of what?" Osei looked at him steadily. He said, "Of being right." What was in the folder? What was in the folder changed everything. Osei had called it the Strand Formula. 11 years of quiet, private, meticulous theoretical work, building on the foundations of his original paper, extending the mathematics into territory that the original paper had not dared to reach. The Strand Formula was a proof, not a theory, not a hypothesis. A mathematical proof, airtight, elegant, devastating in its implications, that the universe we inhabit is not alone. That there are others. Not parallel Earths in the science fiction sense. Not slightly different versions of this reality with slightly different choices made. Something stranger. Something more fundamental. Distinct reality threads, each with its own physics, its own time flow, its own life. Osei had called them strands. He had been sitting on this for 11 years, alone, in a house full of books, afraid. Cicero read the Strand Formula in silence. He read it the way he read everything that mattered, completely, from the first line to the last, without speaking, without looking up. It took 4 hours. When he finished, he set the folder down very carefully, the way you set down something that has just become irreplaceable. He looked at Osei. Osei was watching him from the armchair. He had been watching him for most of those 4 hours. His whiskey glass was empty, and he had not refilled it. Cicero said, "You proved it." Not a question. Osei said, "Yes." Cicero said, 11 years ago. Osei said, "The mathematics took 11 years. The courage to sit with it took longer." He paused. He looked at his hands, large hands, a physicist's hands, slightly unsteady now, in the way that hands become unsteady when you have asked them to carry too much for too long. He said, "I am giving it to you, not because I am done with it, because you are the only person I have met who will know what to do with it." That evening, the third evening,
They sat in Osei's garden. The Nairobi night was warm and enormous. Stars filled the sky in the way that stars fill the sky when you are far from city light, completely, extravagantly, as if the universe has decided to stop being modest. They were quiet for a long time, the comfortable quiet of two people who do not need to fill the silence between them. The kind of quiet that only exists between people who have known each other long enough that silence is a form of conversation. Then Osei said, not looking at Cicero, looking up at the sky, "You're going to build the machine." Not a question. Osei never asked questions he knew the answer to. Cicero said, "Yes." Osei was quiet for a moment. Then, "And after the machine?" Cicero considered the question. He said, "The strands." Osei nodded slowly, once, the nod of a man confirming something he had already known. He said, "I thought so." He was quiet again. The stars above them, the warm night, the garden that Osei had planted when he moved here, when the academic world had finished with him and he had needed something alive to tend. Then Osei said something that Cicero would carry for 100 years after Osei was gone from the world. "Cicero, be careful what you become in the pursuit of what you understand. The universe will show you everything you ask to see. It will not tell you what it costs." He left the next morning. He stood at Osei's door with the folder under his arm. The Strand Formula, 11 years of quiet courage given to him like a torch passed in a relay race. Osei stood in the doorway. He looked. Cicero noticed this and filed it away, the way he filed everything, carefully, where he could find it later. He looked tired in a way that was not about the late nights, the kind of tired that is not fixed by sleep.
Cicero said, "I'll call you when the first test runs." Osei looked at him. Something moved behind his eyes, something that knew more than it was saying, the way old eyes often know more than they say. He said, "Yes, you do that." He reached out, and this was not something Osei did easily, physical gestures of tenderness. He reached out and put his hand briefly on Cicero's shoulder. 1 beat, 2 beats. Then he let go. He stepped back inside and closed the door. Cicero stood on the path for a moment. The Nairobi morning was warm and golden and full of birds. He looked at the closed door. Then he turned and walked away. He did not know, as he walked away from that door, that it was the last time. He did not know that Osei's hands, those large, unsteady hands that had just rested on his shoulder, were carrying something that had been growing quietly for 2 years. That the tiredness was not from the late nights. That the glass that was never quite empty had been a way of keeping the pain at a distance that was becoming harder and harder to maintain. He did not know. And Osei had not told him. Because Osei had decided, in the way that certain people decide certain things, quietly and finally and without discussion, that Cicero's work was more important than Cicero's grief. That the torch mattered more than the moment of passing it. There are people who love you so much they refuse to be a burden to you. It is, depending on how you look at it, the most generous thing a person can do. Or the cruelest. He went back to the warehouse. What else would he do? He sat on the warehouse floor with the Strand Formula open on his lap. He read it again, not because he needed to. He had read it 4 times on the flight back from Nairobi. He read it because reading it was a way of being with Osei without being with Osei. The device in front of him, half-assembled, patient, waiting, caught the lamplight the way it always did. He looked at it, and then at the folder, and then at it again. He said to no one, "Okay. Okay." And he got up, and he went to work. Saya arrived the following morning. She came through the warehouse door with a bag over one shoulder and a coffee in each hand. 2 coffees, one for her, one for him, because she had been bringing him coffee since the first week they worked together, and she had never once asked if he wanted it because she already knew that he always did and would never think to ask for himself. She stopped when she saw the Strand Formula folder open on his desk. She set both coffees down carefully. She picked up the folder. She began to read. She read for 11 minutes. Cicero watched her, something he rarely did with anyone, just watched. The way you watch something you haven't decided what to do with yet. When she finished, she set the folder down with the same careful exactness he had used. She looked at him. She said, "Where did you get this?" He said, "Osei." She was quiet for a moment. She understood everything that word contained. Then she said, not softly, not gently, but directly, because that was how Saya said everything that mattered. "Then we have to build something worthy of it." She picked up her coffee. She sat down at the desk beside him. She opened her own notebook. And that was that. What they built over the weeks that followed was not the machine that Cicero had originally designed. The Strand Formula changed the mathematics. What had been a temporal displacement device, a machine for moving through time within a single reality, now had to become something fundamentally different. A machine that could find the seams between realities, the boundaries between strands, the places where the quantum foam was thin enough that something, someone, might push through. The engineering challenges were extraordinary. Saya brought her biology, her understanding of how living systems interact with quantum fields at the cellular level, and it turned out this was not a small contribution. The machine would not just need to find the boundary, it would need to carry a human body through it. Alive. This was, Saya noted in her journal one night, an additional complication. They worked in the way that serious people work when they are working on something that matters, without adequate sleep, without adequate food, with an intensity that would look, to anyone who did not understand what they were doing, dangerously close to a kind of madness. But it was not madness. It was the opposite of madness. It was the specific clarity that comes from knowing exactly what you are trying to do and having, for perhaps the first time in your life, everything you need to try to do it. Saya kept a log of the days. In it, she wrote things that were useful and things that were not strictly necessary, but that she wrote anyway, because she was a scientist who had learned that the things that seem unnecessary are often the things that matter most later. One entry from the 31st day. He doesn't talk about Osei. He doesn't talk about much that isn't directly related to the machine. But sometimes, when he thinks I'm not watching, he looks at the Strand Formula folder the way a person looks at a photograph. The first real test came on day 47. Not the full machine, not a human subject. A piece of fruit, a small orange, placed inside a localized temporal field that Cicero had been refining for 3 weeks. The theory was simple enough to state. If the field worked as the mathematics predicted, the fruit inside would experience time at a different rate than the world outside it. The fruit would age slowly, or not at all. Simple. clean, testable. The field activated. The equipment registered correctly. The readings were, within acceptable tolerance, exactly what the mathematics predicted. And the orange did not age. For 32 seconds, while the world moved forward at its normal pace, the orange simply stayed. The same orange it had been before the field went on. Not older, not younger, just still. Cicero stood in front of it for a very long time without moving. Saya, watching from across the warehouse, said nothing. She understood from the quality of his stillness that this was not a moment for words. What Cicero was feeling, looking at that orange, he would not have called it joy. He would not have called it triumph. He would have called it recognition. The feeling of a proof becoming real. Of mathematics, which had always been for him more real than the physical world, finally agreeing to be visible. He looked at that orange for a full minute and 30 seconds. Then he looked at Saya. He said, and in his voice was the quiet of someone who has just seen something they have been trying to see for 20 years. "It's there." She said, "I know." He said, "Time isn't what they think it is." She said, "No, it never was." That evening, Cicero picked up his phone to call Osei. He had been meaning to call since Nairobi. He had not called, not because he didn't want to, but because every day the machine had needed something, and the machine always needed something, and Osei would understand. Osei had always understood. He picked up the phone. The call connected on the second ring, but it was not Osei's voice that answered. It was a woman's voice, careful, kind, carrying the specific weight of someone who has been preparing for this particular phone call. "Cicero, this is Amara, Hakeem's daughter." Cicero said nothing. She said, "He passed away this morning, in his sleep. It was peaceful, they said. He didn't suffer." The warehouse was very quiet around Cicero. The equipment hummed. The lamp burned. The orange, still in its temporal field housing, waiting for the morning test, sat on the work table. Cicero said, "Thank you for calling." His voice was completely steady. He hung up. He did not cry. This was not because he was not feeling something. It was because what he was feeling was too large for crying. Crying is what you do when the feeling is the right size for tears, when it fits inside the body and needs to come out. What Cicero felt, standing in his warehouse after that phone call, was not the right size for anything. It was the size of 19 years. The size of a man who opened his door before you knocked. The size of a glass that was never quite empty. The size of a whiteboard covered in equations that the world had not been ready for. The size of a folder kept in a locked drawer for 11 years, waiting for the right person. He sat down on the warehouse floor. He put his back against the work table. He looked at the device. He stayed there for a very long time. He was back at the whiteboard by 3 in the morning. Saya arrived at 7, earlier than usual, because something had told her, in the way that certain people's instincts are tuned to the frequencies of certain other people, that she should come earlier than usual.
She came through the warehouse door. She saw him at the whiteboard, the same position he had been in when she left the night before, except that the equations had progressed by what looked like 6 or 7 hours of work. She looked at the equations. She looked at him. She said, "Cicero." He did not turn around. He said, "The cross-dimensional field harmonics in section 3 need to be recalculated. The Strand Formula gives us a correction factor that the original design didn't account for." Saya put her bag down. She stood behind him for a moment. She said quietly, "When?" And he knew, without any explanation needed, because this was Saya, who always knew what was actually being asked. He knew she was not asking about the equations. He said, "Yesterday evening." A long silence. Then Saya said, not gently, because gentle would have been wrong. Osei would have been wrong for gentle. She said with the full weight of someone who means it, "He knew what you were going to do with what he gave you. He was proud of it, of you. I think he knew he wouldn't be here to see it, and I think he decided that was all right." Cicero was quiet for a long moment. His marker, which had been moving, stopped. He said, and this was as close as he would come in the entire episode to letting what he was carrying be visible, "He shouldn't have decided that. He should have told me." Saya said nothing. There was nothing to say. She picked up a marker from the tray below the whiteboard. She looked at section 3. She said, "Show me the correction factor." The funeral was 7 days later, attended by 7 people. Cicero was one of them. He stood at the grave in the warm Nairobi earth under a sky that was very blue and very far away. Amara, Osei's daughter, a quiet woman in her 40s who had her father's eyes, spoke briefly and beautifully. Afterward, she found Cicero and pressed something into his hand without saying anything. A key, small, ordinary. He recognized it. It was the key Osei had worn around his neck. The key to the drawer. The key to 11 years of courage. He closed his hand around it. He did not trust himself to speak. He nodded. She nodded back. That was enough. Later, much later, after the others had gone, Cicero went back to Osei's house, alone. He let himself in with a key Amara had given him. There were things of Osei's that he had been asked to collect, papers and books that Osei had wanted him to have. He stood in the empty house. Without Osei in it, the house was just a house. The books were still there. The armchair was still there, still holding the shape of the man who had sat in it for 20 years. The whiteboard was still there. He went to the whiteboard. He stood in front of it for a long time. The faded equations, the work that had been done here, the ghost of a mind that had asked the right questions and paid the price for asking them. Then he did something he had not planned to do. He picked up a piece of chalk from the tray. He found an empty space on the whiteboard. He wrote one line, a single equation, the opening line of the Strand Formula, Osei's proof, written in Cicero's hand. He stepped back. He looked at what he had written. Then he set the chalk down. He took one photograph of the whiteboard with his phone, and he left. There was one more thing, something that Cicero did not know about, something happening in a building he had never visited, in a city he was not in, between people he had not yet met. While he stood at Osei's grave, while he gathered Osei's papers, while he wrote one line on Osei's whiteboard, in a Helix Corp intelligence facility in Zurich, a man named Director Solon Pike was reading a report. The report was about Cicero. It contained the transcript of a phone call, recorded without authorization, processed without hesitation, analyzed without remorse. A phone call between Cicero and someone in Nairobi, 3 days old. The report noted that Cicero had been in possession of an unknown theoretical document obtained from a known flagged academic, Dr. Hakeem Osei, now deceased, no longer a direct concern. The report recommended escalating surveillance. It recommended something else as well. Pike read that recommendation twice. Then he signed it. Back in Geneva, the warehouse, late. Cicero at his desk, Osei's key on the table beside him, the Strand Formula folder open to the first page. Saya had gone home an hour ago. The warehouse was his again. Quiet. Still.
He opened his journal. He turned to a new page. He wrote, Day 51. He stopped. He looked at what he had written. He crossed out Day 51. He wrote instead, Osei. And then, nothing. He held the pen. He held it for a long time. He was not crying. He was not going to cry. He was doing the thing that people like Cicero do when the world asks them to feel something they cannot afford to stop and feel completely. He was converting it, turning it from grief into fuel, from loss into purpose, from the man who was gone into the reason to keep building the thing the man believed in. It is, depending on how you look at it, a very efficient way of surviving. Or a way of not surviving at all, of simply moving very fast through the wreckage, building as you go, never looking back long enough to see what you have left in the rubble. He closed the journal. He picked up his marker. He went to the whiteboard. He began to write. The equations filled the whiteboard. Then a second whiteboard. Then the backs of 3 pages of printer paper taped to the wall when the whiteboards ran out. Outside, the Geneva night moved through its hours toward morning. Inside, the lamp burned. And on the work table, still patient, unchanged since the test 2 weeks ago, the small orange sat in its temporal housing. Not aging, not moving forward, just waiting. The way everything in this story waited. For Cicero to be ready. He did not know that someone was already watching. He did not know that the thing Osei had warned him about, the people with money, the people with power, the people who had decided it was more useful to bury the truth than to build on it. He did not know they had already decided what to do with him. He only knew the equations. He only knew the work. He only knew that a man he loved had given him something extraordinary and trusted him with it. And he was not going to waste it.